The chamber of the Galactic Council was alive with its usual noise, 1,000 voices from 1,000 worlds, rising and falling in disputes over territory, over trade, over the endless balancing of power that kept the galaxy from tearing itself. The great hall was lit by pillars of crystal that shimmered with shifting colors, each glow carrying the history of empires. Old and young delegates stood tall in their pride, their arrogance woven into every gesture, believing themselves secure in their dominion over the starjet. On this day, the rhythm of politics would break, for into the chamber hurried a messenger, his robes torn as if he had run through storms, his face pale with terror. He clutched a device in his hands and fell to his knees before the elder council, his voice shaking as he demanded to be heard. The chamber stilled. Slowly, one by one, the voices quieted until only his words carried across the vast room. He activated the device, and a projection filled the air. At the center of the chamber, the light shimmered, and then hardened into an image that burned into the eyes of all who beheld it. It was not a fleet, it was not a fleet, it was not even a threat. It was the sight of human children, small, fragile, and terrified, locked behind the bars of cages, their eyes wide with fear, their hands gripping the cold metal as if clinging to hope that was slipping away. The chamber gasped, not in sympathy but in shock, for never before had such a blatant act been revealed within the walls of the council itself. Delegates whispered in frantic tones, trying to comprehend what they saw. Some laughed nervously, claiming it must be an illusion. Others leaned forward, eyes narrowing as truth became undeniable. The children were real, their suffering undeniable. The question struck them like thunder. Who had dared do this? Who had thought humanity so weak that their children could be treated as animals? The messenger spoke again, his voice trembling. He named the faction responsible. He described how they had captured the children from a colony unprotected on the edge of space, believing there would be no consequence, believing humanity would remain silent as it always had. The words echoed through the chamber, and the weight of them pressed down on every delegate, for they all knew the risk. They all knew that humanity, silent for centuries, patient beyond reason, might not stay silent. Now the chamber fell. Still none dared move. As the image of the children flickered above them, some delegates shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another. Their thoughts raced. Could humanity strike back? Could this be the spark that shattered the long balance of power? They remembered the history of Earth, the wars fought with relentless resolve, the survival against odds that had broken other species. Humanity was not mighty in numbers, humanity was mighty in spirit. In that silence, the chamber trembled, not from weapons, not from war, but from the realization that the galaxy had crossed a line it could never uncross. For caging human children was no insult. It was a wound, and wounds demand reckoning. The silence that filled the council chamber grew heavier with every heartbeat. Delegates who had moments earlier been arguing about tariffs and borders now sat frozen in their seats, staring at the projection of human children behind cold bars. The light of the image painted every face with shame, fear, or disbelief. The chamber that had always been a theater of arrogance now felt like a tomb holding its breath. Whispers began to crawl through the ranks of council members, at first faint, then louder. The Saurian delegate leaned toward his neighbor, muttering that humanity had always been insignificant, yet even he could not keep his voice from trembling. The Lithari elder, whose race was known for compassion, lowered her head, unable to watch the image of children gripping metal bars with tiny hands. The silence of centuries now echoed in every corner of the chamber, reminding them all of what they had ignored for far too long. The council had long mocked humanity. They called Earth a relic, a planet clinging to survival with outdated ships and little influence. They believed the silence of humans meant irrelevance, not patience. The arrogance of the great powers had painted humanity as an afterthought, not worthy of respect or fear. Yet, as the projection continued to flicker, the reality pressed upon them like a storm waiting to break. Humanity was not absent, humanity was not defeated. Humanity was watching. The envoy of the faction, accused of caging the children, finally rose. He was a broad figure, covered in dark armor plates, his voice harsh as he declared that the humans were only detained for order. He claimed that they were dangerous, even in their youth, and that caging them was a precaution necessary for the safety of his people. His words rang through the chamber like stone grinding against metal, but they carried no weight, only cowardice. A ripple of disgust spread across the chamber, though few dared to voice it. The arrogance of his defense only deepened. The uneasy delegates exchanged glances, their thoughts unspoken but shared. How could he not see the danger? How could anyone believe that humanity would accept this act without consequence? Humanity had been silent for centuries, but even silence has its limits. From the back of the chamber, the human envoy stood. His presence had gone unnoticed until now, for humanity had rarely chosen to send representatives. His figure was plain, draped in simple garments, his posture calm, yet there was a quiet power in the way he carried himself. The chamber turned to him as if drawn by gravity itself. He said nothing, at first only, letting his gaze sweep across the hall. His eyes met the image of the children above the council, and a shadow passed across his face. The weight of that silence spoke louder than any words. The delegates shifted uncomfortably, sensing the storm. Hidden in the stillness, they realized with sudden clarity that the caging of human children was not a political misstep. It was not a mere insult. It was a strike at the very heart of a race that had endured and survived beyond measure. The whispers ceased again. The chamber waited as if bracing for the thunder that would surely follow. The council chamber trembled with expectation as the human envoy finally stepped forward into the light. His footsteps echoed across the polished floor, each sound carrying the weight of centuries of silence. Every eye turned toward him, from the proudest warlords to the youngest delegates, and even the ones who despised humanity felt their breath catch in their throats. He was not draped in armor nor surrounded by guards, yet his presence was heavier than any fleet. The envoy stood beneath the hovering projection of the children, caged and afraid. His eyes lifted and lingered on their faces as if he could see beyond the flickering image, as if he could feel their fear reaching across the void of distance. When he turned back to the chamber, his voice was steady and calm, but the power within it carried like thunder rolling across the mountains. He did not shout yet. Every delegate heard him clearly. He asked if the council understood what had been done. He asked if they comprehended the line that had been crossed. The envoy of the guilty faction rose again, his tone dismissive. He claimed that humans were unpredictable and dangerous, even their children, he said. The cages were mercy compared to extermination. He mocked the human envoy, daring him to protest, daring him to threaten. The chamber buzzed with shock at his arrogance, but the human envoy did not move. His expression remained still, his silence pressing down harder than any words. Then the envoy spoke again. He reminded the chamber of humanity's history of survival. He recounted how Earth had endured plagues, wars, disasters, and invasions by forces far greater than itself. He spoke of how humanity had risen, each time stronger than before. He said humanity did not forget and humanity did not forgive. He told the council that the image of those children would be carved into the memory of every human, and that such a memory would not fade but burn until justice was delivered. The chamber shook with whispers. Once more, some delegates clutched their robes as if struck by cold. Others narrowed their eyes, calculating the cost of what had been done. The Lithari elder leaned forward and muttered that caging children was a crime against every living being, not just humans. Her words carried weight among the younger races, who began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The envoy of the guilty faction sneered once more, but his bravado faltered. The silence of the human envoy was unshakable, his calmness more terrifying than anger. The delegates who had once mocked humanity now saw something else within him. They saw restraint held tightly like a blade, still sheathed but capable of striking with a force none could withstand. The human envoy finished. With only one sentence, he told the council that they had not insulted humanity, they had awakened it, and with those words the chamber fell into a silence so complete that even the air seemed to hold its breath, for every delegate now understood that the storm they had long ignored was rising, and no one could predict how far its fury would reach. The chamber rippled with unease as the final words of the human envoy echoed through the crystalline hall. Delegates who had built their reputations on arrogance and dominance now found themselves unable to meet his gaze. Their voices caught in their throats, their hands fidgeted nervously with robes or devices, as though some hidden tool might protect them from the storm that loomed unseen. The projection of the caged children still hovered above the council, its light cold and merciless, as it reminded all who looked that innocence had been broken. The elder of the Lithari finally rose, her thin frame trembling though her eyes burned with quiet fire. She declared that no child of any species should ever be caged, that this act was not merely a political mistake but a crime against existence itself. Her words rang through the chamber, carrying a weight that silenced many who would have dismissed them in other moments. She turned to the human envoy and bowed her head, a gesture of respect rarely given and never given lightly. The younger races murmured in agreement, their voices small but sincere. The envoy of the guilty faction slammed his staff upon the ground, his voice rising in anger. He accused the Lithari elder of weakness. He claimed that compassion was nothing but a tool for manipulation. He tried to shift blame onto humanity itself, arguing that humans had invited such treatment. Through their refusal to fully participate in the council, he declared them outsiders, unworthy of protection. His words echoed hollowly across the chamber, for even those who once shared his arrogance now recoiled from him. The human envoy did not respond immediately. He stood in silence, allowing the guilty faction to drown. In its own words, the longer he stood unmoved, the more the chamber understood that his restraint was deliberate, that behind his calm demeanor lay a force that none wished to awaken. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but every delegate leaned forward to hear. He asked the guilty envoy if he had ever seen the strength of a human child. He asked if he had ever witnessed how fiercely they cling to hope, even in darkness. He said that caging such children was not only cruelty, it was folly, for no cage could contain what burned within Thema. Heavy silence followed. The younger races shuddered at the truth in his words. The older powers shifted uneasily, unwilling to admit their fear, but unable to deny it. The image of the children no longer looked like weakness. It looked like a spark waiting to ignite a fire that could consume the galaxy. The delegates felt it in their bones that humanity's patience was ending, and once it ended, there would be no return. The chamber doors opened suddenly, and another messenger entered, his face pale as he announced reports from the outer systems. Human fleets were moving. Ships long dormant were rising from hidden bases, engines roared to life, and formations spread across the void. The council gasped as the truth began to crystallize. Humanity was no longer silent. Humanity was preparing. The guilty envoy faltered, his bravado breaking for the first time as he looked around and found no allies standing with him. The chamber had turned the tide. Humanity had spoken, and the galaxy trembled before the storm they had unleashed. The image of the children flickered once more above the council chamber, as if the projection itself carried a heartbeat of its own. Their small faces shone in the pale light, their hands clinging desperately to the bars that confined them. Some of the children were crying, others sat in silence, their eyes hard with defiance, but every one of them radiated a power the council could not deny. Innocence held in chains was a wound that cut deeper than fleets or weapons. Delegates who had scoffed at the messenger earlier now lowered their heads, unable to hold the gaze of those tiny eyes. The Lithari elder whispered softly, but she could see her own grandchildren in those faces, and her voice trembled with sorrow. The Varan delegate, known for his cold logic, muttered that caging such fragile lives was not only cruel but strategically foolish, for the heart of humanity was bound to erupt in fury. The chamber filled with restless movement as delegates shifted uncomfortably, each one wrestling with fear and guilt. The guilty faction envoy attempted once more to dismiss the projection. He called it theater, a display meant to sway emotions rather than reason, but his voice rang hollow, and few listened anymore. His words were swallowed by the weight of the image itself, for no argument could erase the raw truth of what every eye beheld. The more he spoke, the more isolated he became, until even those who once supported him turned away. The human envoy raised his hand, and the murmurs died instantly. His voice was calm, yet carried the force of judgment. He spoke of how children are the essence of every civilization. He said that to harm them was to destroy the future itself. He told the council that the cages were not only an insult to humanity but an insult to existence, for within those children lay not only the spirit of Earth but the spark of the galaxy itself. The chamber fell silent again. As his words sank into every heart, the younger races shifted in their seats, and many of them nodded with conviction. They knew the truth of his words, for they too had children, and the thought of their own young locked in such cages filled them with rage. The older empires remained silent, yet even their eyes betrayed unease, for they understood the storm such an act had awakened outside the chamber. More reports arrived. Human colonies across the stars were uniting, voices rising in unison. Ships were being readied, supplies gathered, entire populations stirred from their long, quiet state. Messages spread across networks faster than light, proclaiming that the children would be freed, no matter the cost. The galaxy listened, and felt the weight of inevitability pressing closer. The human envoy lowered his gaze for a moment, as if gathering strength. When he looked back up, his eyes burned with a calm fire. He declared that the image of the children would not fade. Humanity would carry it into every negotiation, every battle, and every moment until justice was complete. His words were not shouted yet, they echoed louder than any cry of war. The council delegates trembled as they realized the truth. Humanity had been underestimated, mocked and dismissed, but no one could dismiss children in cages. That image had shattered the illusion of weakness and replaced it with a reckoning that could not be stopped. Beyond the walls of the council chamber, the galaxy stirred as the weight of the revelation spread through every channel of communication. Traders carried whispers of the caged human children from port to port, and the whispers became storms entire. Colonies halted their routines as they watched the same projection now broadcast across hidden networks. The sight of children locked behind cold bars ignited something in the hearts of many races, and what began as shock began to grow into out. The quiet corners of the stars' fleets began to awaken. Human vessels, long believed to be relics, stirred within hidden bases carved into asteroids and buried beneath the icy crusts of moons. Their engines flared to life, glowing with renewed energy. Their hulls carried the marks of centuries of silence, yet their designs revealed advancements the Council had never seen. Before long, squadrons of ships began moving in formation, leaving trails of fire across the darkness. Humanity had been silent, but silence had been preparationalized to begin to reveal themselves. The Lithari, whose elder had spoken out first, sent messages of support, pledging resources to aid the humans. The younger races followed hesitantly at first, but with growing boldness. They had always feared the older empires that dominated the council, but now they saw a chance to break the chains of arrogance. For if humanity could rise from silence, then perhaps they could rise to the caging of children, was the spark that gave them courage. The older empires sat in silence, their pride crumbling, as reports flooded in of fleets uniting against them. The Zorathians, who once boasted of unmatched strength, now whispered behind closed doors, fearing the storm. Humanity was not alone, and the council could feel the shift. The balance of power, long thought immovable, was tilting with every moment as humanity gathered strength, not only from its own colonies but from allies, moved by the raw truth of innocence betrayed inside the council chamber. The human envoy stood still, his silence more powerful than declarations. His presence reminded them all that humanity did not need to roar, humanity only needed to act. The guilty faction envoy shifted uneasily, his armor no longer a symbol of strength but of cowardice. His attempts to justify the cages were drowned out by the steady stream of reports that contradicted every word. He was losing allies. With every breath he took, the delegates began to realize that the galaxy was on the edge of transformation. For centuries humanity had been dismissed as a relic, a whisper of the past, but now that whisper had become a voice that threatened to shake the stars themselves. The caged children were no longer only victims. They were symbols that rallied ships, armies, and entire civilizations. The council knew they had unleashed something that could not be silenced, and as the fleets moved and the allies rose, the council chamber trembled, not with sound but with the weight of inevitability. The storm of humanity had begun to gather, and soon it would break across every world. The council chamber, once proud and filled with the arrogance of countless empires, had become a place of shadows and trembling voices. The image of the caged children still hovered above the delegates, flickering in the dim light of the crystalline walls. Every whisper carried the weight of fear, every glance carried the tension of unspoken blame. The atmosphere was no longer one of governance, but of survival. As each delegate considered what humanity's awakening would mean for their future act, erupted suddenly. The delegate of the Varen race stood tall and pointed a long finger at the envoy of the guilty faction, demanding to know why such an atrocity had been committed. He accused them of dragging the entire council into ruin. He shouted that their arrogance had endangered every race by provoking humanity in such a brutal way. The words struck like knives, and the chamber filled with noise as others joined in. The Lithari elder spoke again, her voice trembling with sorrow, yet firm. With conviction she declared that the guilty faction had committed an act so vile it stained the honor of the entire council. She insisted that immediate justice be carried out, or the Lithari would withdraw from the Union altogether. Her words emboldened the younger races, who began to murmur in support. Their eyes shone with fire, for they had long been oppressed by the arrogance of the elder empires, and now they saw a chance to break free. The guilty envoy slammed his staff against the floor and roared that the humans were weak, that the cages meant nothing, that the council must not bow to sentiment. His voice was filled with desperation, though he tried to mask it with anger, but the chamber no longer listened to his arrogance. For every delegate could feel the shift in power. Every delegate knew that humanity was no longer silent, and that silence had been their greatest shield. The human envoy did not move. He stood at the center of the storm, watching calmly as voices clashed and alliances shifted. His silence was a blade sharper than any words. Each time the guilty envoy tried to speak, his eyes would flicker to the human and falter, as if the weight of centuries of patience pressed upon him. The envoy finally whispered his own words, low but piercing. He said humanity had no need to shout for the truth of the cages, spoke louder than anything he could ever say. The chamber grew restless. Delegates who once mocked humanity now whispered of alliances and reparations. They began to turn their backs on the guilty faction, fearing that siding with them would mean sharing in their destruction. The guilty envoy who once walked with pride now stood alone, his allies evaporating, his voice powerless against the tide of judgment. For the first time in the long history of the council, the balance of power was tilting not through fleets or weapons but through morality and truth. The caged children were the fulcrum upon which the galaxy shifted, and every delegate felt the tremor as their world began to crack. The council trembled, and the guilty stood alone while humanity remained silent, yet stronger than ever. The chamber lay in uneasy silence after the storm of accusations. The delegates sat, frozen, weighed down by the gravity of what they had witnessed. The guilty faction envoy stood trembling, his staff still clutched in his hands, but no allies remained. Beside him his arrogance had crumbled, leaving only fear and isolation. In the center of the chamber, the human envoy finally raised his head, and the entire hall seemed to lean forward as if drawn by an invisible force. His voice was calm, steady, and deliberate, yet it carried a weight that pressed against every heart. He declared that humanity did not come for vengeance. Humanity did not hunger for conquest. Humanity came for justice. He demanded that those responsible for caging the children be stripped of every title, every privilege, and every protection of the council. He demanded that the children be returned at once to their families. He demanded that every delegate present acknowledge that the lives of human children were sacred and would never again be touched by chains. The words struck like thunder and rippled across the chamber. Some delegates lowered their heads in agreement, their faces pale with shame. The Lithari elder rose and declared her full support for the human envoy, pledging resources to ensure the children were freed. Others followed, one by one, their voices hesitant at first, but growing louder with conviction until the chamber trembled with the sound of reluctant unity. Only the guilty envoy remained, defiant, but his voice was drowned beneath the rising tide. Fear spread among the older empires. They had mocked humanity for centuries and built their power upon that silence, but now they realized that the silence had never been weakness. It had been observation, patience, and preparation. Humanity had waited for the moment when its voice would matter, and now that voice shook the galaxy. The older empires whispered among themselves, considering the cost of refusal. They knew that human fleets were rising across the stars. They knew allies were joining them. They knew that the chamber was shifting, and if they resisted, they would stand against not just humanity but a coalition forged in outrage and truth. The guilty envoy shouted one final protest, his words breaking into anger. He claimed that bowing to humanity would unravel the council. He claimed that yielding to the demand of justice would invite chaos, but his voice cracked and no one stood with him. His words dissolved into the silence of isolation. He lowered his eyes, unable to meet the gaze of the human envoy, who remained calm and unyielding. The chamber trembled, not with weapons but with the power of choice. Every delegate felt the weight of history pressing upon them. They could refuse and face the storm, or they could yield and acknowledge the sanctity of human life. The decision was not only about the children, it was about the place of humanity in the galaxy. It was about whether silence could still be mistaken for weakness, or if silence had revealed itself as the strongest weapon of all. The delegates knew the truth. The reckoning could not be avoided. Humanity had spoken, and the galaxy had no choice but to listen. The chamber air felt thick, as though the weight of countless ages pressed down upon every soul present. The hologram of the caged children still hovered in the center, casting its pale blue glow across alien faces marked with guilt, fear, and hesitation. The human envoy remained motionless, yet his presence dominated the entire hall. His words from before echoed in the silence, demanding justice, demanding acknowledgement that the lives of human children were sacred. The delegates now faced the moment where words had to become action. One by one, the voices began to declare their votes. The Lithari were the first, their elder rising with a solemn bow. She proclaimed that her people would never stand with those who harmed the innocent and cast her full support behind the humans. Her declaration sent ripples through the chamber, emboldening others to rise. The younger races, who had long been silenced by the weight of the elder empires, now spoke with fire in their voices. They pledged to humanity and demanded the release of the children. The chorus grew stronger, louder, impossible to ignore. The Older empires hesitated. Their pride was a fortress they had built for centuries, but even fortresses can crumble under truth and fear. They exchanged glances, whispering calculations of survival. They could not deny that humanity's fleets had awakened. They could not deny that entire worlds now rallied behind humanity's cause. They could not deny the silent power of the envoy, who had spoken few words, but had shaken their thrones more than any armada could. The truth was plain to see. Refusal meant war, a war they could not win at last. The guilty envoy rose for the final time. His eyes burned with fury, but his voice faltered as he proclaimed that his people would never bow. He cursed the council for betraying their traditions. He cursed the humans for daring to rise against the old order. But even as he raged, the chamber no longer listened. His words fell into emptiness, and his figure seemed smaller. With every breath he realized, too late, that isolation was a greater prison than any cage. He sank back into his seat, defeated and alone. The final vote passed. Humanity had been granted its demand. The children would be freed, the guilty faction would be stripped of their power and placed under trial. The chamber erupted, not with applause but with a solemn silence. For all knew that the galaxy had changed forever. Humanity was no longer the quiet observer. It was now a power that commanded respect, forged not through conquest but through the undeniable truth of innocence betrayed outside. The chamber news spread across the stars. Entire civilizations watched the turning point unfold. As transmissions announced the decision, worlds, once indifferent, now felt the stirrings of admiration and fear for humanity. They saw not only a people wronged, but a people willing to rise without bowing to cruelty. They saw that silence had been a mask, and beneath it was a force, strong enough to alter the galaxy. The human envoy lowered his gaze, and for the first time allowed himself a breath of relief. His mission was not for vengeance, but for justice, and justice had been claimed. The council trembled, not because of warships or weapons, but because humanity had revealed its true strength, a strength that would never again be ignored.